The morning of August 1st, 2025, General Motors executives watched their stock price plummet as they announced $1.1 billion in quarterly losses directly tied to President Trump's new tariffs. Within hours, Ford followed with $800 million in damages. Stanley Black Decker projected similar devastation. These weren't projections or warnings anymore. This was real money vanishing from American companies in real time. When Trump expanded tariffs to over 70 countries that day, imposing a crushing 35% levy on Canadian imports, he promised it would bring jobs back and force better deals. Instead, American workers started losing their jobs within weeks. The numbers tell a brutal story. Between 30,000 and 40,000 manufacturing jobs disappeared in just 4 months. Walmart and Best Buy began raising prices on everything from shampoo to shoes. Even that morning, coffee became a casualty. With Brazil facing new tariffs and supplying a third of America's coffee imports, economists warned prices would spike across the board. This could trigger a 1.8% increase in consumer prices, one Federal Reserve analyst noted privately. That's equivalent to a $2,400 income loss per household. We're essentially imposing a hidden tax on every American family. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While Trump's tariffs were designed to punish Canada and force submission, Prime Minister Mark Carney refused to play the expected role. Instead of retaliating with emotion or rushing to sign a bad deal, Canada did something far more strategic. It simply adapted. The exemptions tell the real story. Despite the dramatic 35% headline number, Trump's team quietly excluded Canadian oil from the tariffs. This wasn't a small oversight. Canada supplies over 4 million barrels daily to the U.S., representing between 50 and 70% of American oil imports. Those Midwest refineries built specifically for heavy Canadian crude, they kept running without interruption. Trump wanted to look tough without crashing the American economy, explained a senior trade official who requested anonymity. Taxing Canadian oil would have sent gas prices through the roof within days. Even he understood that political suicide. The pattern extended beyond oil. Natural gas, uranium for nuclear plants, and cross-border electricity remained untouched. Even the much-publicized copper tariffs turned out to be more bark than bite. The 50% rate only applied to semi-finished products like tubes and wiring, while Canada primarily exports cathodes and concentrates that escaped the new rules entirely. Canada had quietly positioned itself for exactly this scenario. Over 80% of its exports to the U.S. still fell under USMCA protections, rendering Trump's tariff threats largely symbolic. While steel, aluminum, and some auto parts faced the new rates, the economic foundation of the relationship remained intact. North of the border, the impact was real but manageable. Statistics Canada reported a 13% drop in total exports during the second quarter, with energy exports down nearly 20%. Alberta felt the squeeze hardest. But instead of panicking, Carney's government executed a calculated pivot that caught Washington off guard. Within days of the tariff announcement, Canadian Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne and Foreign Minister Anita Anand were on a plane to Mexico City. Their mission was clear: strengthen ties with Mexico and explore alternatives to American dependence. The meetings with President Claudia Sheinbaum weren't just diplomatic courtesy. They were laying groundwork for what insiders called the Northern Corridor, a potential $120 billion trade route bypassing the United States entirely. The contrast in approaches became stark. Trump's strategy relied on public pressure and dramatic deadlines. Just hours before the August 1st deadline, he posted on Truth Social linking trade negotiations to Canada's position on Palestinian statehood. One day the issue was trade balances, the next, it was foreign policy alignment. Carney's response was telling. No angry tweets, no rushed press conferences. Instead, Canada simply stated negotiations would continue past Trump's arbitrary deadline. Unlike South Korea or the EU, which had signed template agreements under pressure, Canada refused to accept a deal that didn't serve its interests. The Canadian public backed this approach. having witnessed the effectiveness of retaliatory measures during Trump's first term, when removing American whiskey from shelves caused real political pain in bourbon-producing states. Many favored strategic patience over reactive escalation. Polls showed Canadians increasingly viewed Trump's tactics not as serious diplomacy, but as political theater. Meanwhile, the damage to American credibility accumulated quietly but steadily. The U.S.-Canada relationship, once a model of international cooperation, now looked increasingly transactional and unstable. Financial markets reflected this uncertainty. While Toronto Stock Exchange futures rose 0.6% on strong corporate earnings from companies like Shopify, American indices showed mixed results. Investors recognized a fundamental shift. Canada was proving more resilient than expected, while American companies bore the immediate costs of their own government's policies. The irony was inescapable. Trump's tariffs, designed to project American strength and extract concessions, instead highlighted American vulnerabilities. Every job lost in Detroit, every price increase at Walmart, every corporate earnings warning demonstrated that, in the interconnected North American economy, weapons aimed at neighbors often wound the shooter first. The real shock came when China entered the picture. While Trump was busy strong-arming Canada, Beijing quietly executed a masterstroke that would reshape global trade for decades. On August 15th, just 2 weeks after the Canadian tariffs took effect, China announced a landmark agreement with Canada worth $180 billion over 5 years. The deal was breathtaking in scope. China would purchase Canadian oil at premium prices, invest in new pipeline infrastructure to the Pacific coast, and guarantee long-term contracts for minerals critical to electric vehicle production. But the crown jewel was technology transfer. Chinese companies would share advanced battery technology and AI research with Canadian firms, creating a tech corridor that completely bypassed Silicon Valley. The timing was no accident. While American refineries scrambled to maintain Canadian oil supplies despite the tariffs, China offered Canada something Trump never could: respect as an equal partner. No ultimatums, no social media threats, just business. The contrast wasn't lost on Ottawa. Within 48 hours of the China-Canada announcement, alarm bells rang across Washington. The Committee on Foreign Investment suddenly discovered national security concerns about Chinese investments in Canadian mining operations that supplied American defense contractors. But it was too late. Canada had already approved the deals, and any American interference would only push them further into Beijing's embrace. The ripple effects spread faster than anyone anticipated. Mexico, watching Canada's pivot, began its own negotiations with China. European companies started routing investments through Toronto instead of New York. The dollar's share of global trade settlements dropped by 2.3% in just 1 quarter, the steepest decline since the 2008 financial crisis. The auto industry became ground zero for this new reality. General Motors CEO Mary Barra faced an impossible choice. The company's Windsor, Ontario plant produced engines for trucks assembled in Michigan. The tariffs made this cross-border production model suddenly unviable, but moving production entirely to the U.S. would take years and cost billions. Meanwhile, Chinese automaker BYD offered to buy the Windsor facility and convert it to electric vehicle production for the Canadian market. The human cost mounted daily. In Buffalo, New York, the Jameson family ran a small logistics company that had thrived for 3 generations moving goods across the Peace Bridge. By September, they were laying off half their workforce. Similar stories echoed across border communities. Nurses who lived in Windsor and worked in Detroit faced impossible commutes as new border restrictions added hours to crossing times. The legendary cooperation between Canadian and American first responders during emergencies ground to a halt as bureaucratic barriers multiplied. But perhaps the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: American farmers. Canada had quietly become the largest importer of American agricultural products, purchasing $25 billion annually. When Canada shifted those purchases to Brazil and Argentina as part of its diversification strategy, farm bankruptcies in Iowa and Nebraska spiked by 40%.
The U.S. beef industry leaders are confident long-standing Chinese restrictions on imports of U.S. beef will be lifted. China is concerned about the safety of U.S. beef since the mad cow disease broke out in 2003.
Some experts are saying the increases could come as a result of the new reciprocal tariffs put in place yesterday by President Trump. So what does all of this mean for our local beef, cattle, and pork farmers? Mark Livermore breaks that down.
The moment China rejected 150,000 tons of American beef worth over $500 million, ranchers across Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska watched their livelihoods evaporate overnight. This wasn't just another trade dispute. It was the opening salvo in a massive realignment of global food security that would see Russia capture a $1.2 billion market in mere weeks. The rejection came without warning. Ships loaded with premium American beef sat stranded at Chinese ports as inspectors suddenly found safety violations that hadn't existed days before. The timing was no coincidence. Just 72 hours earlier, Washington had announced expanded tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and Beijing's response was swift, calculated, and devastating. "We prepared these shipments for months," a Nebraska cattle producer explained, watching prices crater as contracts worth millions dissolved. "One day we're celebrating record exports to China. The next we're dumping product on the domestic market at a 40% loss." The numbers paint a stark picture. In 2024, American beef exports to China had soared past $1.2 billion, representing nearly 12% of China's imported beef market. By early 2025, that share had collapsed below 6%, with no diplomatic solution in sight. But this wasn't just about meat. It was about power, leverage, and the future of global trade. As American ranchers scrambled to find new buyers, Moscow was already moving. Russian cargo trains loaded with beef began rolling across newly constructed rail lines directly into western China. The infrastructure hadn't existed just months before, but a 2023 agreement between Beijing and Moscow had quietly laid the groundwork for this moment. The speed of Russia's market capture stunned industry observers. In the first quarter of 2025 alone, Russian beef shipments to China exploded by over 300%. What made this possible wasn't just increased production. It was a complete reimagining of how international food trade could work. The Russians aren't just selling beef, noted one trade analyst studying the shift. They're offering China something far more valuable, a reliable partner who shares their vision for a new economic order. A new trade order emerged as payments shifted to yuan and rubles, bypassing the dollar. Direct rail links cut delivery times, and Russia adopted China's strict food safety rules. In Beijing, restaurants like Homeplate BBQ replaced U.S. beef with cheaper Australian alternatives, as American meat vanished from Chinese menus. But Russia's agricultural ambitions extended far beyond filling America's abandoned market share. The Kremlin unveiled a $1.1 billion investment plan to double beef production by 2027, with massive new farms under construction across Siberia. This wasn't opportunistic market grabbing. It was a long-term strategic pivot that had been years in the making. The transformation went deeper than simple trade substitution. China was systematically rebuilding its entire food supply chain around political alignment rather than pure economics. Traditional suppliers like Argentina struggled with inflation and instability, while Australia faced ongoing inspection issues despite gradually warming relations. Into this gap stepped not just Russia, but Kazakhstan, Belarus, and other nations willing to accept China's terms for a new kind of trade relationship. "What we're witnessing is the weaponization of food security," explained a former USDA official watching the shifts unfold. China isn't just changing suppliers, they're creating an entirely parallel system of global trade. The evidence supported this assessment. In March 2025, Beijing expanded its agricultural offensive, imposing new tariffs on over 700 American farm products including pork, dairy, almonds, and sorghum. The $11 billion worth of affected trade sent shockwaves through rural America, where farmers had built their businesses around Chinese demand. The ripple effects spread far beyond the farms. Feed suppliers watched orders evaporate. Transportation companies parked trucks as shipments dried up. Cold storage facilities designed for export preparation sat empty. In small towns across America's heartland, the China trade that had brought prosperity for 2 decades was vanishing in real time. Meanwhile, the new trade corridors hummed with activity. Russian beef crossed into China through modernized border checkpoints, cleared by inspectors who found no issues with meat that met their standards. Payment systems operated smoothly outside Western financial networks. Long-term contracts locked in prices and volumes for years ahead, creating the stability that China prized above all else. The strategic implications were staggering. China imports roughly a quarter of its beef consumption, making it the world's largest buyer. Whoever controlled access to this market held enormous leverage over global food prices and agricultural investment. By shifting from American to Russian suppliers, Beijing wasn't just changing vendors, it was fundamentally altering the balance of agricultural power. Once these new systems are in place, they're almost impossible to reverse, warned Deborah Elms from the Asian Trade Center. It's not just about mending diplomatic relations. The entire infrastructure of trade, from payment systems to quality standards to logistics networks, gets rebuilt around new partnerships. The transformation extended beyond bilateral deals. China was actively building a food security network spanning multiple continents, all operating outside traditional Western-dominated channels. Deals with Brazilian soy producers, New Zealand dairy farms, and African agricultural projects created a web of supply relationships that prioritized political alignment alongside economic efficiency. For American agriculture, the implications were existential. Decades of investment in production capacity geared toward Asian markets suddenly faced obsolescence. The advanced genetics, feeding systems, and processing facilities optimized for Chinese preferences now produced beef for a market that no longer existed. The agricultural heartland wasn't the only battlefield where this economic war was being waged. In Silicon Valley boardrooms and Beijing tech parks, an even more consequential struggle was unfolding over the technologies that would define the next century. When NVIDIA's latest AI chips stopped flowing to China in late 2024, it triggered a chain reaction that nobody fully anticipated. Chinese tech giants like Baidu and Alibaba watched their most advanced AI projects grind to a halt, unable to access the computational power that had driven their innovations. But what happened next would reshape the global technology landscape forever. The chip ban was meant to slow China down, a semiconductor industry executive revealed, speaking on condition of anonymity. Instead, it accelerated something far more dangerous: complete technological independence. Within weeks of the expanded restrictions, Beijing announced a staggering $142 billion fund dedicated solely to domestic chip development. This wasn't just throwing money at the problem, it was a coordinated assault on America's technological dominance. Top Chinese scientists working in American labs began receiving offers they couldn't refuse: unlimited budgets, state-of-the-art facilities, and the chance to build a new technological superpower. The brain drain accelerated dramatically. By March 2025, over 3,400 Chinese researchers had left positions at American universities and tech companies to return home. Each departure represented decades of accumulated knowledge walking out the door. MIT lost 12% of its AI research staff in a single semester. Stanford's computer science department watched helplessly as entire research teams dissolved overnight. But China's response went beyond just hiring talent. In an abandoned Huawei facility outside Shenzhen, something extraordinary was taking shape. Engineers worked around the clock on what they called Project Kunlun, a new chip architecture that bypassed American patents entirely. Using a combination of novel materials and unconventional design principles, they were building processors that couldn't match NVIDIA's raw power, but offered something potentially more valuable: complete independence from Western supply chains. The first Kunlun chips rolled off production lines in April 2025. They were only 70% as powerful as their American counterparts, but they were entirely Chinese-made, from silicon to software. More importantly, they were good enough for most AI applications, and they were improving rapidly. Every 3 months, they're closing the gap by 10%, noted a chip analyst tracking Chinese progress. At this rate, they'll reach parity within 2 years, and then we'll have lost our only real advantage. China's industries adapted quickly, replacing U.S. chips with domestic alternatives and fueling internal innovation. American semiconductor firms, cut off from a $180 billion market, saw profits and R&D funding plummet. The collapse of this critical revenue stream shattered the innovation cycle that had long sustained U.S. technological leadership. The tech war expanded into renewables, where China dominated. When the U.S. imposed tariffs on Chinese solar panels and batteries, Beijing struck back, halting exports of key raw materials. With 90% of rare earth processing and 75% of lithium refining under its control, China sent global prices soaring 400%. U.S. energy projects stalled. Efforts to restart domestic mining faced long delays, while China secured decades of supply through global deals. Markets shifted fast. U.S. stocks plummeted, the digital yuan surged, and $400 billion in monthly trade bypassed the dollar. American towns reliant on exports collapsed, left behind in a new economic order. The numbers painted a bleak picture. 680,000 manufacturing jobs lost, farm bankruptcies soaring, and small banks failing. Economic pressure meant to weaken China devastated American towns instead. Young Americans saw futures in tech and agriculture vanish. Washington had overestimated its leverage. China had quietly built alternatives and was ready. While U.S. farmers destroyed unsold crops, China sourced food elsewhere and pushed tech independence. By mid-2025, the global economy had fractured into two competing blocks with distinct currencies and systems. The post-Cold War order collapsed swiftly, replaced by a fragmented, uncertain world racing for resources, allies, and a new balance of power.
U.S. President Donald Trump says he will now impose a 50% tariff on copper imports. He made the declaration at a cabinet meeting in Washington, but it's unclear.
I believe the tariff on copper, we're going to make it 50%. 50%.
What he's doing there, Kelly, is he's going through all of those investigations that have been ongoing into sectoral tariffs.
The moment President Trump's pen hit paper on July 10th, copper prices exploded like a bomb detonating on Wall Street. Within seconds of his signature on the Section 232 proclamation, New York copper futures rocketed past $5.95 per pound, a price never before witnessed in the history of commodities trading.
U.S. President Donald Trump has confirmed in writing his plans for a 50% tariff on all copper imports into his country.
Traders watching their screens couldn't believe their eyes as the metal surged 13% in a single session, the steepest one-day rise ever recorded. But this wasn't just another market fluctuation. This was economic warfare, and Canada found itself directly in the crosshairs. The 50% tariff on imported copper, set to take effect August 1st, sent shockwaves through boardrooms from Toronto to Beijing. For Canada, which ships $9.3 billion worth of copper annually with over half destined for American factories, this was nothing short of an existential threat. The timing couldn't have been more brutal. Canadian miners had just invested billions in expanding production specifically to meet U.S. demand. Within hours of the announcement, the price gap between New York and London copper markets blew open to an unprecedented $1,600 per metric ton. Traders scrambled to exploit this massive arbitrage opportunity, rerouting shipments mid-ocean and creating chaos in global supply chains. Container ships literally changed course while at sea, their captains receiving urgent orders to redirect cargo toward the higher-priced American market. This is economic madness, declared Jonathan Price, CEO of Teck Resources, Canada's largest copper producer. We're watching decades of integrated supply chains unravel in real time. The president just handed China a gift wrapped in protectionist paper. The mathematics of destruction were staggering. Every electric vehicle rolling off North American assembly lines requires up to 80 kilograms of copper, 4 times more than a traditional gasoline car. With the tariff in place, automakers faced an instant $220 cost increase per vehicle just from the copper component alone. Ford's procurement team sent emergency notices to suppliers warning that August invoices would reflect these crushing new costs. But the pain extended far beyond automobiles. Each mile of high-voltage transmission line contains nearly 5 tons of copper. The Biden administration's ambitious grid modernization projects suddenly faced hundreds of millions in additional costs overnight. Utility companies began drafting emergency rate hike applications, preparing to pass these expenses directly to consumers. Prime Minister Mark Carney's response was swift and unequivocal. Standing before Parliament, he declared, "Canada will not be bullied into submission. We have options, we have allies, and we have the resolve to protect our workers and our economy." Behind closed doors, his trade team was already executing contingency plans drafted months earlier when Trump first threatened aluminum tariffs. The irony was bitter. Just 10 days before the copper bombshell, Ottawa had made a major concession, scrapping its 3% digital services tax that would have raised $5.9 billion over 5 years. Canadian officials thought they'd bought peace. Instead, they'd merely delayed the inevitable confrontation. Tech Resources activated what insiders called Operation Eastern Pivot within 48 hours. The company booked warehouse space in South Korea and began negotiating long-term contracts with Asian smelters. Provincial officials from Quebec flew emergency missions to Lima and Santiago, seeking alternative buyers for Canadian concentrate. The message was clear. If America didn't want Canadian copper, Asia would gladly take it. The market response was immediate and brutal. Toronto's TSX Materials Index plunged, while shares of American copper producers like Freeport-McMoRan ticked higher. But this wasn't the clean victory protectionists had promised. UBS analysts calculated that if the premium between U.S. and global copper prices persisted through September, American manufacturers would pay an extra $4.2 billion in just one quarter, enough to slice half a percentage point off GDP growth. We're witnessing the most significant disruption to North American metals trade since the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, observed Dr. Sarah Chen, chief economist at the Peterson Institute. The president seems to believe we can simply flip a switch and produce all our copper domestically. The reality is our smelting capacity has been declining for decades. Indeed, the numbers told a sobering story. America imported 810,000 metric tons of refined copper in 2024, with domestic production meeting barely half of industrial demand. The mothballed smelters Trump hoped to revive would take years and billions in investment to restart. Hudbay Minerals' much-touted Copper World project in Arizona wouldn't produce its first pound until 2029 at the earliest. Meanwhile, on Main Street, the sticker shock was becoming real. Cox Automotive calculated that between copper, steel, and aluminum tariffs, a car built in Windsor or Monterey now carried an extra $6,000 price tag. Even Detroit-made pickups absorbed about $3,000 in metal surcharges. For American families already struggling with inflation, these weren't abstract policy debates. They were $1,000 bills arriving at the worst possible time. The housing market faced an even grimmer picture. The National Association of Home Builders reported that tariffs on metals and lumber had already lifted the cost of a new house by $17,000 to $22,000, effectively wiping out an entire down payment for first-time buyers. With copper prices soaring, those figures would only climb higher. As July 10th turned to July 11th, warehouses in New Orleans reported a 40% surge in inbound copper cathode as traders rushed to import metal before the August 1st deadline. The London Metal Exchange watched its stocks drain as every available pound flowed toward the premium-priced American market. It was a gold rush in reverse. Instead of prospectors heading to the hills, refined metal was racing to beat a ticking clock. The Chinese watched this chaos unfold with barely concealed satisfaction. Within 72 hours of Trump's announcement, Beijing's trade representatives were on planes to Vancouver, offering to purchase every pound of copper Canada couldn't sell to America. "We're prepared to sign 10-year contracts at premium prices," revealed Zhang Wei, deputy director of China's Strategic Metals Reserve Bureau, during a hastily arranged press conference in Shanghai. If our American friends wish to isolate themselves from global supply chains, we're happy to fill the void. This wasn't empty rhetoric. Chinese state-owned enterprises immediately began negotiating deals worth $4.7 billion with Canadian producers, effectively capturing supply that had flowed south for generations. The speed was breathtaking. What took decades to build between USMCA partners was being dismantled and redirected to Asia in mere days. Former Federal Reserve economist Michael Patterson put it bluntly, "We just handed China control over North American copper on a silver platter. They're securing long-term supply agreements while we're creating artificial shortages. It's economic self-destruction disguised as patriotism." The ripple effects spread like wildfire through America's industrial heartland. Whirlpool's Ohio factories faced an immediate $47 million annual cost increase just from copper components in their appliances. General Electric's turbine division calculated that each wind generator would now cost an additional $185,000 to manufacture. These weren't numbers buried in quarterly reports, they were pink slips waiting to happen. By late July, the first casualties emerged. Southwire Company, America's largest wire and cable manufacturer, announced a hiring freeze affecting 7,000 workers across 6 states. Their CEO, Rich Stinson, didn't mince words. "We're being forced to choose between absorbing impossible costs or losing contracts to foreign competitors who can access cheaper copper. Either way, American workers lose." The construction industry's response was even more dramatic. Bechtel and Fluor, 2 engineering giants with combined revenues exceeding $40 billion, jointly petitioned the Commerce Department for emergency exemptions. Their message was stark. Without relief, infrastructure projects worth $23 billion would face immediate delays or cancellations. The very roads, bridges, and power grids Trump promised to rebuild were now hostage to his own trade policy. Inside the Pentagon, alarm bells were ringing. A classified briefing revealed that defense contractors needed 47,000 metric tons of copper annually for everything from fighter jets to naval vessels. With prices skyrocketing and supply chains fragmenting, the Defense Department's procurement costs jumped by $890 million overnight. "We're compromising national security for a trade war photo op," one unnamed admiral told colleagues during a heated Joint Chiefs meeting. Canada's retaliation came swift and surgical. On July 18th, Ottawa announced export licenses would be required for all critical minerals shipments to the United States, effective immediately. The bureaucratic weapon was devastating in its simplicity. Every pound of Canadian nickel, lithium, and rare earth elements would now face potential delays and denials. For American battery manufacturers dependent on Canadian materials, it was like watching their supply chains evaporate in slow motion. "Make no mistake, we didn't want this fight," Prime Minister Carney told a packed press gallery. "But if Washington insists on treating its closest ally as an adversary, we'll respond accordingly. Our minerals will find eager buyers in Europe and Asia." The European Union seized the opportunity with both hands. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen flew to Ottawa personally, offering Canada immediate inclusion in the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act. The deal promised European investment in Canadian mines, guaranteed purchase agreements, and technology transfers. Everything America was now denying its northern neighbor. Back in New York, the London Metal Exchange reported its most volatile trading week in history. Copper premiums swung wildly as algorithms struggled to price in political risk. Hedge funds lost a combined $3.2 billion in 3 days as their models, trained on decades of stable North American trade, imploded spectacularly. Renaissance Technologies' flagship medallion fund, usually a bastion of mathematical precision, posted its worst monthly performance since 2008. The copper tariff crisis devastated communities and industries. In Thompson, Manitoba, job losses loomed as copper mining halted. In Arizona, investors abandoned the 7-beta resolution copper project, eyeing Peru instead. U.S. manufacturers paid $1.8 billion in tariffs in August alone, sparking outrage. Tesla moved battery production to Shanghai, Apple delayed iPhones, and John Deere shifted to Brazil. The S&P 500 materials sector tanked, and Goldman Sachs cut GDP forecasts. Diplomatically, U.S. credibility eroded at the G20. By late September, inflation fears and looming recession signaled disaster. A policy meant to protect U.S. industry had become its own worst enemy.